and interaction with human-robot partners in November, and the interest for the inactive approach was really impressive. So this is the reason why I decided to suggest to have a common workshop with 3 specific topics actually from my talk. And these are inactive cognition in general. What is it? What is inactive cognition and human experience? And Francesco is going to give a talk about this topic with a focus on virtual reality. The second one was the ICAP robot, and this is the topic of Alessandra Sciutti. She works for the Istituto Italiano di Tecnologia, and this is the center, the institute in which the ICAP was actually developed and designed from the beginning. And the last topic was emotion and feeling, with reference to the development of robots. This is the topic of Lola today. So we have, as I wrote, we have 3 guests. Francesco Parisi, she works in Messina. She's an assistant professor, and I was really very impressed from his work on eco-media, and he's going to present this notion today. And I would say that we can start with Francesco. So the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Alfonsina, for the invitation, first of all, and thank you everybody for joining in today in this special occasion. Unfortunately, I am not in Paris right now. I'd like to be there, as you can imagine, but this is all we can have. So thank you really for this opportunity to share with you some ideas about an active cognition and how it can be implemented in the case of virtual reality. I'd like to share my screen with you. So let me choose the source of, yeah, this should be, are you seeing? Can you see it?
Yes.
Okay, it's great. Okay, so my topic today will be about an active cognition, or better, 4E cognition, and the case of virtual reality. I started working on this topic almost 1.5 years ago, maybe 2 years ago. I have already presented it in a couple of conferences, one of which was the one organized by Alfonsina in Göttingen in August 19. Since then, I have keep working on it, and I applied last January for a PRIN in Italy. PRIN is a project of interest, research project of interest, by the way. And I hope to find some money to experiment, to lead some experiments that I want to introduce here for the first time, basically. So this is the outline of the talk. I will introduce the concept of media as generally conceived in everyday language, but also I want to offer a different conception of the term, according to which media have to be considered as environment, as spaces we move in, not just as tools we use, but as spaces we can explore, where we can perform actions into. And then I will discuss the relationship between our bodies and what I defined ecomedia. And I'm going to explain you what I mean by this term. Then I will try to present two concepts that are really highly investigated nowadays. The concept of material engagement, as developed by Lambros Malafouris in his book, in 2013 book, titled How Things Shape the Mind. So the idea that things of the world are capable of shaping our cognition. And the concept of mediation coming from media theory, media scholars like Richard Grusin, for example. Then I will get into Fourier cognition that you probably know. The idea that cognition is embodied and embedded, extended, and active. And then I will focus on the case of visual media, in particular, the case of virtual reality. And I will try to suggest the idea that action in the context of virtual reality is much more important than perception for the insurgence of cognitive illusions, or, which is the same, cognitive opportunities. Okay. My perspective is the perspective of a media scholar. I studied communication and then I got a PhD in cognitive sciences. So my approach is hybrid, is double-faced. I'm interested in the way media affect us in their effects on our cognition by adopting a cognitive approach, especially an embodied, extended, and active cognitive approach. So I want to start with the story narrated by David Foster Wallace in his most famous novel, which is Infinite Jest. The story goes this way. There are two young fishes swimming along, and they happen to meet an older fish swimming the other way, who nods at them and says, "Morning, boys, how's the water?" And the two young fish swim on for a bit, and then eventually one of them looks over at the other and goes, "What the hell is the water?" So the point of this novel is that the more something affects us, the more invisible it is to our senses, to our knowledge. This seems to be a law of every media engagement. Think, for example, to your shoes. You don't think explicitly to your shoes while walking. If you did that, that would mean that your shoes are uncomfortable. The best way for your shoes to work is when they disappear from they are transparent to your consciousness, okay? But the point is that precisely the most transparent things are the ones that are impactful on our cognition. The ones that play a huge role in determining our phenomenal experience, okay? So it's like a paradox, you know? Something that seems to be invisible and without any effect is actually the most impactful and important component of our phenomenal experience, the way we interact with the surrounding world. Okay, what do we mean by media? This term is a common term. Usually when I ask this question to my students, they always reply, well, we mean TV, internet, magazines, radio, etc. So there is a kind of analogy between media and communication media. Basically, when we think naively to media, we always think to something that transmits information, that delivers information. But in my perspective, everything is a medium. My sunglasses are a medium, allowing me to tolerate direct sunlight. Our shoes, our clothes, weapons, transportation, and everything, every artifactual thing that is in between, that is between us, between the organism and the environment, can be considered as a media, okay? So media, it's almost everything. Also this room where I am in this moment is a medium, because is an artifact that regulates my relationship with the environment, okay? So we have to extremely enlarge our conception of media, maybe too much, but everything is in the middle, between us and the world can be considered a medium. Okay. I just dedicated this slide to the famous movie Metropolis, because it was one of the first representations of the effect of automatization on human cognition. I developed a model, a theory, an interpretation of all this stuff in this book that was published just before the emergence of COVID started. So actually, I didn't have many occasions to discuss the implications of the book, except in some rare circumstances. Consider the talk of today an analysis of one of the chapters of the book, the one dedicated precisely to virtual reality. So, bodies. According to embodied cognition, as you probably know, cognition cannot be fully understood if we set aside the body, if we don't integrate in the explanation the role, the constitutive role that the body exercises on the general effects, on the general deployment of cognition. The famous paleoanthropologist André Leroy-Gourhan said that we are a kind of animal that is not specialized in nothing. We are not very fast. We do not have any particular sight or view. We cannot see as well as a leopard, for example, can do, or an eagle. We are not so fast as runners. We are not so strong. But this kind of unspecialization is actually what makes us particularly equipped. Equipped with what? With things. Our ethological attitude is the one of building stuff. We build stuff. We are Homo faber. But you might say, well, also the spider builds its network, its net, its web, spider web. Also, other animals use things to interact with the world or build things. But there is a crucial difference. We build things and we are also changed by the things we build. This is a very important difference. The spider always builds the same web. It is not changed by a previous web. Instead, we are in a loop where things we have built determine new conditions of possibility for the insurgence of the construction of another thing that starts over new. We are within this loop since the very beginning of our evolutionary story on this planet. And this is what an active embedded cognition basically states, that precisely we do things and we are changed by the things we do, okay? So we are not just plastic, we are metaplastic, because we are changed by the surrounding stuff we have produced. We are going to see in more detail what I'm saying now, where I'm just sketching right now. So there is the organism, there is the body, and then there is the environment. There is the surrounding environment. And in that book, I try to highlight one point. The environment, the so-called world, is not a natural one. No? Every world is, in many occasions of our life, an artificial world. A room, a train, a bus, a house, you know? And this is why, and it is filled with things, the microphone, the keyboard, the bottle, my sunglasses, etc. So the world is never a natural world, uncontaminated world. So this is why I introduced the term ecomedia, which describes precisely the continuity between the tools, the things we use, and the spaces we live in. Some tools have ecological characteristics, and some spaces have instrumental characteristics. So there is a sort, I want simply to synthesize in a word the idea that spaces, sometimes we use spaces as tools. Sometimes we interact with tools as if they were spaces. Consider, for example, what we are doing right now. We are talking to each other as if we are in a room together, but actually we are doing this through devices, through tools, but we act as if we were sharing a space, a common space, okay? So ecomedia should synthesize this conceptual blending, so to speak. Things and spaces are hardly separable in real life, okay? Please interrupt me if you have any questions or whatever. So every discussion I have made so far has to be framed within the context of 4E cognition. Cognition is embodied, embedded, extended, and enacted. I am not going to, fully explore the differences between the E's and also the differences between each E. For example, embedded is not a unified perspective. Maybe it's not even embodied is just one homogeneous current. An active cognition is less than defined. We have, one of the first perspective by Alva Noe, which actually is a sensory motor approach. Then we have Thompson. Roots of this way of thinking can be ascribed to Varela and Maturana, but also Hutto and Min, and Gallagher and Di Paolo, etc. So there are many souls of the enactive enterprise, so to speak. We can detect the roots of this movement in the concept of autopoiesis, but the model has been developed through the last 25 years, 30 years, a lot. Now that I'm thinking, maybe 30 years ago was published Embodied Cognition by Varela, Thompson, and Roche. It was 91, if I remember well. So, which is the characteristic of the enactive cognition. I don't know your background, so maybe I'm just saying things that are obvious for you, but just to say the minimum. The world is enacted in the sense that the agent has to make sense of the world because of, in virtue of his or her precariousness and his attempt to preserve his structure and to try to figure it out, and there is not a center, there is not homunculus driving everything. Everything is relational, brain, body, world. There is not, Malafouris says, a prime mover. There is not a center, as I said, but everything is relational. Other E's maintain something similar, but with different degrees of radicality, so to speak. Okay. Within the context of cognitive sciences, this term is getting momentum nowadays. Is the concept of material engagement, as developed by Lambros Malafouris in this book, How Things Shape the Mind. But you can find also a description of this concept in the volume written by Ian Hodder, Where Are We Heading? Material engagement is the idea according to which cognition is entangled, is engaged with things. Consider that this theory was developed in the context of cognitive archaeology. So Lambros Malafouris wants to establish how modern minds became as they are. What's the process through which we became modern humans? And he's convinced that our cognition evolves, changes because of the encounter, of the material encounter with things. Okay, so there is the agent, there is his sensory motor sense making, which is regulated by some kind of a force, some kind of affordances. He talks about the so-called enactive sign. So the idea that a sign is not something that is linguistically given, but it's something that is materially determined. Okay, so material engagement is one of the terms of the discussion. The other one is the term mediation, as developed by Richard Grusin, especially in his paper, 2015 paper. You can download it and have a concise representation of this concept. Mediation, what is mediation? Mediation is a radicalization of material engagement. In material engagement, but this is my reading of it, Lambros Malafouris wouldn't agree with that. We discussed about this many times. In my opinion, material engagement is relative to a given subject who is more or less extended by the encounter with things, okay? But the subject is well defined and individuated, to use a Simondonian terminology. In mediation instead, subject and word co-evolve together, so are mutually redefined. This distinction is, in my opinion, but I am sharing with you my perspective. This difference, the difference between material engagement, I would say bare material engagement, and mediation or radical mediation, is precisely the capability of the tool to reinvent the subject, to redefine the subject in an unexpected way, in a completely new way. While material engagement is just a way for the subject to be extended or to embody some technological features. I hope that through the example of virtual reality, this distinction becomes clearer. Okay, why visual media? Well, because first of all, visual media, we are visual animals. I'm not saying that we have to embrace an oculocentric perspective. Perception is always action, obviously, but there is no doubt that through vision, we acquire a lot of information about the surrounding world. We use vision to establish most of our relations with motor sensory-motor relations with the world. So audiovisual media are a study case particularly important because they are a technological improvement that is old, very old, and very new at the same time. Why very old? Think of the mirror, for example, or instead of the mirror, to think of reflecting surfaces. The Chinese word for mirror is oh my God, maybe Alfonsina, you can help me. A pozza d'acqua is in English, a place where there is some water in it, no? So the idea that reflection is capable of reflection of the self. So the idea that you can see yourself projected onto a reflecting surface. We know what kind of impact had on psychology and philosophy. Think of Lacan, Freud, and Merleau-Ponty, who wrote about the mirror and the effect that it has on our self-perception and the construction of an ability that wouldn't exist without the mirror itself. Visual self-recognition, for example, is a cognitive ability that wouldn't exist without a specific tool capable of triggering it, okay? So visual media are ancient, are present in our evolution, but only recently we have developed particular visual media that are capable of reproducing reality and recording reality, okay? This is photography, as you can easily see. Cinema, okay, but also phenakistoscope and zoopraxiscope were the antecedent of these tools exploiting the phenomenon known as retinal persistence. So if you put some pictures in a certain sequence, our brain-eye system builds the illusion of perceiving movement, okay? So we exploited these mechanisms of our consciousness to create, cinema and all the other visual technologies that we know. Why photography is so important in this context? Because it allowed us to see for the first time something that was biologically invisible. Now we are used to it. We are not so much impressed by the idea that we can see, Mars, okay? Or we can see the surface of the moon, or we can see our skeleton. It's obvious. But imagine the surprise. Imagine the astonishment. People were literally amazed by the opportunity to have a picture of their faces, which was not made by another guy, okay? But that was automatically produced. So it was like a mirror, but with memory. This is one of the oldest definitions of photography. A mirror with memory. So we started duplicating the world. We started to engage relations with our old pictures, portraying us as kids, as younger. It's a kind of existential exploration that was impossible 2 centuries ago, okay? So visual media created a gap, created a multiplication of realities. There is not just the ecological reality, the one made of physical stuff, no? There is also the imaginarium. There is also another world where we live, where we grow, where we build relationships, where we create parallel lives. This can be metaphorical, but not so much, okay? We have digital identities, okay? We cultivate relationships with other people we have never met before, etc., etc. You are familiar with this because it belongs to all of us, okay? In this line, in this progression of visual technologies, there is one in particular, and I'm going to finish my talk here, that, you know, concretizes the metaphor that visual media are spaces in a more concrete way if compared to the other ones. Okay, you might say, I feel immersed in a story, no? I feel transported into the world, the narrative, the diegetic world of a movie, okay? But all these things are just metaphorical. You are always seated on your couch while affirming that you are sharing the perspective of the character. Well, with virtual reality, things are a little bit different because in virtual reality, you actually perform actions into a virtual environment. It's not a matter of mirroring, as Vittorio Gallese and Michele Guerra explored clearly in their book, The Empathic Screen. It's not a matter of resonance, of motor resonance allowed by mirror neurons. So I look at the screen, I share the emotional condition, I am empathetic with the character so I can share his perspective. In that case, I am still looking at the story. I am just sitting there. I am not responsible for their actions. They are the only people responsible of what is going on. In virtual reality, things can be different. I brought here the example of installation Carne y Arena by Alejandro González Iñárritu, not because it's an exemplum of what I'm saying now, but because it's a kind of virtual reality that is too much reduced, too much close to the cinematographic model. In this installation, you are just able to watch what is going on while wearing your head-mounted display. You cannot touch people. You cannot, you pass through other people. So you have the feeling that even if you are immersed in the show, you are not present in it. The difference between being immersed and being present is crucial, okay? And it's what, in my opinion, creates a shift in virtual reality and active cognition. What we know about virtual reality in experimental context? Well, in 2007, on the same number of Science, 2 articles were published. The one by Eric Erson, that you can see portrayed in this picture, and the other one by another guy, Lennenberg. His name, I think his name is Lennenberg. And by the way, the point is that in 2007, scientific community became aware of the fact that if properly stimulated through virtual reality, we can experience what is known now as out-of-body experience or full-body illusion. The idea that my body, consider how crazy is this point, my body is out there, okay? My body doesn't belong to me anymore. I am not my body anymore. I am the perspective of my body portrayed by the camera which is in front of me. This is a kind of combination of rubber hand illusion that probably you know more closely, and and sensory substitution devices. Okay, so through virtual reality, we can think of it, think how radical it is. We can lose the feeling of our body and transfer it in another place, just in a few minutes. Okay, see, it is sufficient to mislead our brain to get a strong, powerful illusion. I don't know if you come across sometimes the experiments by Vilayanu Ramachandran concerning the phantom limb. Through the mirror, Ramachandran notoriously allowed people affected by amputation to stop suffering because they had the illusion of having again two arms by exploiting a vertical mirror in a box. Okay, so illusions reveal a lot about the way we work. This is another picture portraying what can happen, body swapping. I can feel as if I were in your body and vice versa. Okay, so when I saw these experiments, I asked myself, wow, if virtual reality is capable of altering, modifying something so rooted in our phenomenology, like, you know, the ownership of our own body, what can we get by exploiting this kind of technology? And especially, what's special about virtual reality? Why virtual reality is capable of triggering such powerful illusions? Why so? Why this happens? What's the difference between cinema, photography, and and mirrors? Okay, this is just a quote from Thomas Fuchs, which is an activist after all, and Alfonsina knows him very well, and I took this quote because of the use of the word mediation. So the brain is primarily an organ of mediation, transformation, and modulation, being embedded in the human organism's relationships with the surrounding world and in interpersonal relationships. What I found interesting from my perspective is the idea that the brain is just, you know, a regulator, a mediator between input and the brain says, you give me the input and then I'll take care of it. So as long as the input are our hands or our eyes, everything is normal. But if we change the input, if we make the brain believe that our body is out there, well, the brain, okay, you know what, maybe our body is out there. So it's highly plastic. It's highly metaplastic, as I said. Meta is the idea that plasticity is induced not only by biological stimuli, but also by artifactual stimuli. As I said, Bakirita in 1969 showed that we can hear through eyes, you know, we can see through ears. Okay, so that we can substitute our senses, that there is the brain has this capability to adapt to new circumstances and to replace a sensory motor capability. Okay, but let's get back to the main question. What's so special about virtual reality? I took the model developed by Giuseppe Riva, who is a psychologist based in Milan. Presence is defined as the non-mediated, pre-reflexive perception of successfully transforming intentions in action which is an action, within an external world. Okay? In other words, continues, the subject is present in a space if he, she can act in it. Interestingly, what we need for presence are both the affordance for action, that is the possibility of acting, and it's an action, the possibility of successfully acting. The first suggestion this framework offers to the developers of virtual worlds is that for presence, action is more important than perception. And this is what virtual reality actually offers. So virtual reality is a parallel world, is a virtual world where we can act in. But there are some problems. There are some problems for many reasons. One reason is that many virtual reality installations are just, you know, cinema without the frame, a borderless cinema. But that's not the most intriguing application of virtual reality. Just a moment, because the screen is suddenly, okay. Let me show this video. And in order to introduce a feature that, in my opinion, can create a real gap between what we can nowadays do in virtual reality and what we can achieve if a proper model is developed. What are you seeing? What are you watching is a glove, is an haptic glove, which confers to the virtual experience that thing that is so important for embodied cognizers: touch and haptic feedback, resistance when I touch something, so grip, the possibility to have a fine and precise control, motor control of the environment, of the virtual environment. These gloves have been developed already, I applied for having them in our lab so that we can design an experimental protocol, which I'm going to talk about, because they allow to experience virtual reality for what it actually matters. So as long as I can just watch a show, nothing special happens with virtual reality. But in the moment when I become capable of acting in it, not just moving around, but grasping, no? And having haptic feedback of it, well, I bet that something interesting can occur. And we now can go back to the concept of mediation and material engagement through the concept of zero mode developed by Di Paolo and colleagues in their book, Sensory Motor Life. What is the zero mode? This is the last chapter of the book and it's relative to virtual actions. Activity in the zero mode is what drives spontaneous creativity in agents capable of sensory motor open-endedness. Save this point, sensory motor open-endedness. So not a predefined repertoire of sensory motor opportunities. No, something that has to be discovered, that has to be created by a new sensory motor engagement. He goes on saying, we can expect then the zero mode to be active in situations of play as new elements, rules, people, and situations are added to a game, and the self-defining purposes of playful engagements shift. Successfully traversing The zero mode is creative sense-making at its purest. However, and this is the most important part of the sentence, this only occurs as the result of the precariousness of the material relations that constitute the agent and the environment. So take this quote and transport it in the virtual reality experience. Imagine, for example, yourself present in a virtual environment and doing something like grasping object with your virtual hands that are not within your usual peripersonal space, no? That are far beyond your peripersonal space. Or think, for example, to the possibility that your hands are 4 and not just 2. What would happen if you started using them successfully? I am ready to bet that after a proper training, you would experience the feeling of having 4 hands, despite the fact that in your entire life, you had the phenomenological feeling of having just 2 hands. But this is the point of mediation. This is the point of being altered, radically altered, being redefined by the tools. The idea that also something like heavily rooted in our cognitive historicity can be completely changed. And my point, my research, is to spot, to detect limits and opportunities of this incoming scenario. Through technologies, we can change our cognition. How far we can do this, how deeply we can do this, is just a matter of exploration. But the most important thing is that we have to abandon the idea that there is a subject, a given subject, which can fulfill some things and which cannot fulfill other things. No, there is just a relational encounter where there is a given agent that can be fully transformed if certain conditions are satisfied. Virtual reality is one of those examples through which we can test, we can push forward these limits beyond the imagination, beyond what we consider possible. And I hope that this story was clear enough to be discussed with you today. Thank you.
So thank you very much for this. And we will find out more with our public and ask if they have any questions. Do you have any questions?
Maybe a short question, if possible.
Yes.
Massimo Leone, University of Torino, now Institute of Advanced Studies. Thank you very much. It was a fascinating lecture, and I learned a lot. At the same time, in your lecture, I had the impression that you talked about technology as if it were a natural element, as if it was there exactly like an apple or a pear or a banana. So this is not the case. There is someone behind the technology that has actually a project. So is it not treating technology somehow artificially separating it from its production environment? So the purposes it has been intended for.
Very good question, which allows me to say 2 different but related things. Well, yes, I am a deterministic person in the sense that I think that technology has its own force, even if it is designed, it is produced by someone, by somebody, then once it appears on the scene, it produces its own laws, its own effects. But beyond that, there is a reason for which I consider technology something as natural. And I try to illustrate this point through the perspective of André Leroy-Gourhan. In his book, Gesture and Speech, one of the side stories of the side theories of the book is that, anatomically speaking, sapiens stopped his evolution. We cannot evolve. I mean, literally, the structure of our skeleton, of our brain, of our head, reached its maximum, its peak. Now, suggests Leroy-Gourhan, we externalize, we continue our evolution by creating stuff in the world. But your question is right. I mean, there is also a dimension, the dimension of power, for example, or money, that affect a lot technological dynamics. And in my book, in the introduction, I put this disclaimer just at the beginning, because I stated that, okay, this book is focuses on the very baseline of material engagement, of technological engagement, the one that does not involve economic, social, or even interpersonal dynamics. This is a limit, of course, but it's just epistemological parsimony, because usually what I have noticed in media theory, in media research, is that because of the velocity through which technological progression occurs, we have not the time to appreciate aesthetically what happens, but we have the emergence to define an ethical frame, allowing us to understand and to what is going on, and to adopt, a relative perspective on the matter. But the problem with ethical issues is that they presume. In ethical reasoning, sometimes you don't explain what is going on. You try to suggest what is right, or what should be right. So my intention was exactly to stay on the ground of the relation, just focusing on the material side of the story. But certainly my next book will focus precisely on the objections that you moved. So the other dimensions of the relation that takes into account, power, economics, and design, etc.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Grazie.
Grazie a te.
We have 5 minutes for another question, and then the next topic with Alessandra and the ICAB. Any other questions?
Yes. I have one, actually.
Yeah.
I wanted just to ask, what is the role of the social dimension in this enriching of the human? You very clearly explained how we are born in some sense incomplete, and how we use technology as a way to avoid it. Sorry, stop my video, that's getting crazy. Another important component of our growth, of our expansion of abilities, is really relying on our social interaction with others. And I also appreciated the point that you made about, being able to experience others, also touching them, and that this plays a role. I wanted to hear your opinion on this maybe complementary role, if you want, of technology and social.
Yeah, of course. Interpersonal relationships was the other sacrifice I had to to make in order to outline the book. But my perspective is really close, really close to the one offered by Sean Gallagher, especially the one offered in his last book, where he develops interaction theory. And the idea that there is nothing inner, there is nothing hidden also, but everything is perceivable, and there is our subjectivity is socially constituted. So even if I didn't get into it, it was just the background of the whole story. So for example, would be very interesting to apply this model of virtual reality and sensory motor virtual reality with other people in the room. So we would have both of the crucial dimensions of human phenomenology. We are never alone. So sociality is undeniable, and it's a serious component of much more than. So we can imagine, we can picture three levels, no? The technological, the eco-media engagement. So the organ is the autopoietic system that interacts with his surroundings. No? At the beginning is not even a self. It's just an organism, you know, the infant depends to the child, no? Starting to find regularities in the world. And the caregiver at the beginning, and then the other people, we are constituted by things and other people. So these two dimensions are really fundamental, and would be interesting to combine them in a unified perspective. So thank you.
Thanks.
So I think we can start with Alessandra now and the ICAP. Thank you very much, Francesco.
Thank you, Alfonsina, again.
Thank you. So just, if you're ready, I think we can start. Is 14:50? Yes, we can.
Let me just try and share the screen. I will stop the previous screen share. Let me see if optimize for video clips, don't share sounds, and let me see, please, if you are seeing correctly. Are you seeing the presentation correctly? Can you give me a feedback?
I see.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, that's great. And I hope also the video will work, but we'll see.
Okay.
So I can start, and thank you very much for having me. I'm really pleased to have the occasion to talk a bit about how we could have robots actually help us in the quest of understanding better ourselves. So just to give you an idea of who I am. So I'm a researcher at the Italian Institute of Technology, and I lead the Cognitive Architecture for Collaborative Technologies unit. And I am the principal investigator also of an ERC starting grant, which is called WHISPER. And that is really aimed at understanding how we can establish mutual understanding, shared perception between humans and robots. So the starting point of my research and of the discussion I would like to have with you today is the fact that we as humans are incredibly good since very early in life to interact with each other. So we are, when we are children, even before we learn to speak, we are already very good at establishing rapport, understanding, also with the children of different age, for instance, or with caregivers. which is astounding, especially if we compare this ability with the abilities that today robots and artificial agents sometimes show in terms of social behavior. So despite the incredible advances that we have seen in terms of bodywear, robots move now quite well, quite human-like, quite athlete human-like if you want. And they have an advanced AI, so artificial intelligence is advancing, solving the most complex tasks. Well, despite all of these, we find sometimes robots failing in those which seems the easiest, let's say, task that even a child could understand, like guessing what objects a person wants just from its gaze, or guessing when it is the right time to make a handshake to a person that is approaching us. And why is this so difficult? Which is sometimes called also the Moravec's paradox. Things that are super, or that look super easy to us are very difficult for machines, whereas things that look super difficult to us, like winning a chess game or a Go game, are relatively simpler. Well, one answer is that some things look simple to us because our brain is solving them from us. So we don't have to care about them because they are already solved by our cognition. And the first point that is clear to me now is that we don't see the word for what it is, but our brain continuously augments our perception, shapes it, enriches it to make it easier for us to take rapid and fast decision, especially for what pertains to interaction. So our perception is full of biases, so error, inaccuracies, that are, however, important because make it easier for us to think rapidly and to focus on what matters for real. In some sense, we see our world through a special lenses that derive from our experience of the world. Pardon. The most evident case, of course, is that of the mirror neurons. Because if you think of mirror neurons, you really understand what I mean. So whenever we see an action, we are not just seeing a movement occurring in front of our eyes, we are seeing that, but at the same time, we are evoking the very same areas in our brain that are responsible for performing the action. This means that we are reusing the vocabulary that we have built with our own action. And this, of course, simplifies a lot of understanding of each other. So, and this has a general implication. This has the important outcome that we and machines are not sharing perception. So when we are faced with the very same or identical visual, for instance, stimulus, where the machine can extract very accurate information about the physical appearance of the object, we have a less accurate estimation, but we have a richer, beyond reality perception that entails also an effective content, if you want, but also our, let's say, prior history that helps us to have a deeper understanding, a more profound comprehension of what is there without conscious effort. Most of this happens without us even noticing. It comes natural to us. And this means that even when I'm embedded in the most common interaction, like, you know, a person passing me an object, well, what I see here, again, it's not just a mere movement. I immediately understand that Carlo cares about that toy plush, no? He's handling it with care. So I don't only understand immediately the goal of its behavior, passing me an object. I understand the feelings that are inserted in this movement. And so I will know that if I have to handle this plush, I will have to handle it with care. And this, of course, simplifies a lot the interaction. There is not even the necessity to talk to really understand each other. But this is just one example of the rich multimodal exchange of cues of information that we are continuously passing to each other whenever we are with someone else. So most of this happens below our level of awareness. So it happens while we don't voluntarily control what's happening. And this forms the basis on top of which then we make our social decision, on the basis of which we predict what the other person is going to do and need, and we adapt so as to help or collaborate more in general. But as you can see, it's quite a complex system. So imagine that we want to study this complex system during a human-human interaction. You'd need a way to measure and control this continuous exchange that happens below our awareness over time with the dynamic evolution. Even the best actors sometimes cannot control what it is not under voluntary control. You can imagine a micro expression, you can imagine a slight tick. Those signals happen all the time and they are very informative. So how can you control this while preserving the idea of an interaction? Well, our proposal is by using robots. You might use a robot. We picked the option of a humanoid robot like the iCub, because our idea is that if we might try and model this signals exchange and have the robot use it, then we can get an understanding of this mechanism in a more profound way. And in particular, on the one hand, having a robot allows you full control over what it can do in terms of how it performs an action and which action it performs. But it also adds an additional layer of control, which is we can control how it perceives the world, which of the signals it is caring about, which and how many, and how does it integrate them, and see when it is involved in an interaction, whether the processing of the signal that we propose as an hypothesis works well and allows the interaction to unfold. That's a key point. Having a robot, it allows us to study interaction within an interaction, and this gives a complementary advantage with respect to traditional approaches to the study of action understanding, which are based on a more passive experience of the action. So I maybe look at stimuli on video, for instance. So if we pursue this road, so the approach of using a robot as a way to model this exchange of signals and to try to assess during an interaction if the model works, then there are two ways in which we can imagine of using the robot. On the one hand, as I was mentioning before, we can decide which signals the robot will be sensitive to, which signals and how it should read, and then see whether these signals are enough, for instance, to conduct perfectly the interaction. The other approach, which is complementary, is, well, can we model the same signal onto the robot? So can we make it so that the robot, with its own movement, provides the same information to the human partner, so as to be legible or understandable? And I want to give you a few examples of each of these two ways. So starting from the robot reader, one natural starting point that we considered was that of letting the robot know which kind of facial expression you are making. And we have different approaches implemented. In the video that I hope you are watching, I'm playing the imitation game with the iCub, leveraging on the detection of the action unit of the facial expression that was developed by Anna. And, but we have also other systems that directly from the facial expression are able to infer an estimate of the valence and arousal. So, and how can you use this information? Well, for instance, they can be used in an interaction to inform the robot of the reaction of the human partner to its behavior. Using this input, so the facial expression among others, to adapt, for instance, to the participant personality. A person is particularly eager to interact, is happy when the robot is asking for interaction. Well, I will try to ask for interaction more. A person doesn't like to be so much interactive. Well, the robot will learn that, will adapt, and they will interact less with that specific individual. And that can also apply to other scenarios. So maybe during a training session in which the robot is acting as a sort of a therapist, where it can learn to be mindful of the state of the patient. Let's say if it's a rehabilitation of the trainee, if it's just a long training, not based on performance metrics only, but rather also leveraging on the reading of the natural facial expression that come as a consequence of the training. Another source of information which is particularly rich is the eye gaze. So by looking at where you are looking at, I can infer what is the goal of your action. And this is a case in which we blocked robot perception and limited it to read only the direction of the gaze of the person. Participants were not aware of that. And you see, one participant maybe spoke a lot, another used a lot of pointing, but the robot could only read eyes. And with this limitation, it was still able to detect when it was its turn to act, and also which object between the two in its hands it should pass to the person. This tells us that even one only of this large corolla of signals that we exchange can be already very strong in providing a lot of information. And more recently, we've explored a more detailed understanding of the gaze behavior of participants using also external sensors, as the camera of the robot are not strong enough, let's say, for the moment, to detect fine modification in the gaze behavior. And we realized that by monitoring pupil dilation, for instance, we are able to detect when the cognitive load of the person is increasing. And so this can be used, for instance, to detect when this person are inventing a lie, even in a very short game-like interaction, like a game of cards. But not only face provides information, sorry for the typo, you can also read motion. As I was mentioning in my example before with the plush, we move differently when we are handling objects with care. And so we wanted the robot to be able to sense this just without knowing the object, just monitoring the way a person moves it. And as you can see in the middle panel, you see that the robot is extracting the optical flow. So just the visual changes in the image when an object is moved. And with a tiny bit of machine learning, by extracting simple features like the velocity, the curvature of the motion, the robot is actually able to understand, to learn whether the movement it is observing is careful or not careful, which means that when it will come its time to move that specific object, the robot will be able to adapt and choose the appropriate movement style. So these are a few examples. We have more related to reading movement, to reading reactions of the robot, reading actions with the aim of imitating them. But this was just to give you an idea of how, which kind of approach you can use with a robot to try and detangle or disentangle the roles of different signals in understanding other sections. And there is even much more, and I would really like to point you, if you're interested to look more in depth to this topic, on this book we have recently edited with my collaborators. And I think it's interesting for a lot of readers because we had a very nice group of authors who tried to tackle the question of how to model human motion from 3 different perspectives. So looking at what human studies know about it, looking on why it matters, for instance, in the context of machine learning and computer vision, and last, with what are the implications and the applications that understanding and modeling human motion could have in the context of robotics. Going forward, and the other way that I mentioned before is that of considering the robot as a demonstrator. So this time we are really saying, well, if I understand well what is the signal and how I convey a signal with my movement, I should be able to make it so that also a robot does the same. This will be a sort of evidence that I got it right, that I understood correctly what is the message. And one example that we explored is the communication of style. So whenever we move differently as a function of our mood, if you want. So if I'm calm, or gentle, I move in a certain way. If I'm aggressive or imperative, I move in a different way. And you as an observer can easily get that. And you can do that because actually there is a little part of our brain, the insula, a part of the insula actually, that is sensitive to that. So it responds differently to the very same action if it is performed in a gentle or in aggressive way, so in different styles. We asked ourselves, can also a robot have style? So can it also move in a way that conveys immediately if the robot is gentle and aggressive? So what we tried to do, and it was not easy, I have to say, these are the final results, which are good, but it was a process. We tried to make the robot express the style through its action. You see there by passing an apple, for instance, in a gentle and aggressive way. And we verified through functional magnetic resonance whether the response that the brain of the observer gave were the same as during the observation of a human expressing these 2 styles. And the answer is yes. So if you capture correctly the parameters of a movement that really make it change its style, then it works, despite the fact that the actor is not anymore a human, but a robot. And this is not just interesting from, let's say, a scientific perspective of understanding how the brain works. It has really strong impact on the interaction. Because if the same robot points to an object that I have to fetch, and it points it in an aggressive or in a gentle way, well, my movement toward the object will be different. So if the robot moves aggressively toward the object, I will inherit its style. I will be more aggressive myself. And if it is gentle, I will be gentle with my kinematics. This means that these small, if you want, variations in the way the robot moves have a sort of very strong impact on the way I move. And if you imagine this in an interaction, you can also very clearly understand how this could escalate and really change completely the evolution of the interaction. And recently also we discovered that making the very same robot, so same humanoid appearance, childlike appearance, behave in a more, let's say, human-like way. So as you see now, looking around, smiling at you, talking with you sometimes, saying simple things like hi, etc. Versus having the exact same robot behaving mechanically, has a very strong impact on how you interact and you perceive the world. So this is the experiment that we presented last year at HRI. And this was the manipulation, exactly what I mentioned, having the robot behaving as mechanical, having the robot behaving, let's say, as social, with this very simple looking at, smiling, talking behaviors. And the subjective evaluation that you see on the right really told us that we managed to make the manipulation effective. People understood the difference between these two robots. While these two robots did, however, the very same thing. They showed a segment on the screen, and the task of the participants was to reproduce the length of this segment. So a very simple, very perceptual task. Well, they did it significantly differently as a function of which robot they were interacting with. In particular, the more they felt that the robot was anthropomorphic in the social condition, the more careful, the more accurate they tried to be in their reproduction. This tells us that even the very basic mechanisms of perception can change when we are in presence of something that we believe it's an agent, and that the way the robot moves and coordinates, for instance, gaze and body movement, has a deep impact on our perception during interaction. And again, these are a few examples, but we have expanded a lot on this research, finding out that the way the robot moves can change the perceived effort that participants notice in the robot. And if the robot puts effort in something, then they also tend to put effort on in response to that. And I think that with this very, let's say, extensive series of examples, I have shown you that it's possible to distinguish and investigate with the robot these tiny little building blocks that I was showing before, the single cues. And the limit of this kind of approach, which is super useful to understand which are these building blocks, is that they give you a tool set for the interface, but maybe they don't allow you to see the real evolution of an interaction. And indeed, I agree with that. And therefore, in addition to study the single cues, which is something we are continuing to do because we believe it's important, we are also running two other different type of studies with the robot. The first one is to try and do some more, let's say, free form kind of interaction. This is just an example. So experiments in which we put less control, but we try to engage in a more free form interaction, the participants. In this case, for instance, we used treasure hunt, in which the robot could offer hints to the participants to find hidden objects. And we wanted to study whether trust changed during the interaction. And the interaction was actually very, very free form. Participants had very different approaches. Some of them really did everything by themselves. The other instead opted for relying a lot on the robot. Each one had a very different strategy with respect to the others. And one thing, however, that we could infer from this was that the trust and the reliance that participants had changed during the game, increased, both with quantitative measure of their behavior and with the questionnaires after the game ended. We realized it very clearly. And also, since at the end the robot proposed to gamble what they won if they trusted him, we noticed that a lot of the participants, actually 100% of the participants, had developed enough trust to actually go for the gamble. And a vast majority told us that this depended on the trust that they had on the iCub. And when we checked, we noticed that for all participants, the rapport with the robot got stronger after this 30 minutes game. But the rapport was even stronger for those who decided to gamble and lost. And this was totally against our expectation, because trusting the robot made them lose theoretically money, but still they formed a sort of bond with the robot. And this tells that even this relatively uncontrolled and simplistic reproduction of interaction can really reveal unexpected behaviors in participants, which is even more confirmed from more recent results that we have, in which we made the robot break during the treasure hunt. So the robot stopped working, made strange sounds of movements to show it wasn't working. And during the real interaction, still participants didn't diminish their trust toward the robot, despite the evident robot failures. So this tells us that embedding the robot in a complex interaction where you can't control exactly all the elements or the inputs, still it provides us a very interesting, more holistic view of natural evolution and dynamic of the interaction with participants. This is one road. The other road is really, which I think it's the way to go, is really trying to find a way to make sense over long period of times of all these single signals by building or studying how an architecture, a cognitive architecture, could leverage on all of these together with other important cognitive mechanisms like memory, simulation, and prediction. And also on this, we have certain works. Some of the slides you're actually re-seeing because I presented them when I was discussing about reading the human, but indeed the reading was only part of a larger architecture that was meant to change and make the robot adapt its behavior as a function of other elements in the architecture. For instance, a motivation, an internal drive. But on that, there is quite a lot yet to do. And it might also require our novel understanding also of the basic mechanisms of learning that are used in artificial intelligence, in machine learning domains, that are often focused on parameters, like the performance in a game, that don't take into account so much the social component that instead for our learning are super important. So maybe including an idea of rivalry in competitive learning could make sense. And so really changing the basic component of learning could be needed to reach this kind of architecture. So on this, indeed, this is an effort that we're pursuing in our group, but it is also part of a larger initiative. And Anna Tanesca, who is here at this event, actually, she is the project manager of this initiative, which really aims at understanding better on how to create a cognitive architecture for ICAB, in order to make future robots be able to predict, anticipate, adapt, see beyond reality as we do, and became more considerate of us humans, taking on their shoulder the effort of understanding us, and not the opposite, as it always happens current days. So with that said, I want to thank all the collaborators that make this research possible, and all the studies that I've shown before. And I do also a bit of shameless advertisement. If you happen to have works that could fit, we are hosting a research topic on a shared perception, and in particular, affective shared perception on frontiers. So the deadline is pretty close, but in case you think you have something related, just please let me know. Thanks.
Okay, can you hear me?
I can hear you. I have
to
try and see if I can stop sharing the...
Okay, let's have a look at the time. We have 10 minutes now for questions before the last presentation by Lola. So any questions? Oh.
Yes.
Maybe I have a couple of questions, but no, I don't want to. If there's someone else before, go ahead. I was first before, so go ahead.
Okay.
Okay. Can I just have two quick questions? Thank you for the very interesting talk, of which I share the perspective, the general perspective. They're really convincing. Do you know the perspective proposed by Dumichel and Damiano of interaction between humans and robots? And if you know it, is it similar to the one you offered here, especially for what concerns the idea that interactivity is crucial in this dynamic? And what kind of software, this is a technical question, what kind of software is running into the head of the robots? It's machine learning based, deep learning based, or something? I don't know, I just was curious about the kind of software you used to allow the robot to interpret sensory data. Thank you.
So I'm familiar with work by Michelle and Dabiano. I had the occasion in the past also to talk directly with her, with Luisa, and for sure we share the vision of this importance of exchange. So they speak often about this dialogic kind of, and sometimes I've seen that read or interpreted as giving primacy to speech, whereas from what I read from them and what I understood, this is really not just speech, is whatever it is, an exchange. I think that an important point which we have still to tackle in some sense, but it will be crucial, is this idea of coevolution. So on the one hand, we have a robot, on the one hand, we have a human, but up to the point in which you have this dialogic kind of exchanges, of course, you can make the robot adapt to the human, but you cannot avoid, and you don't want to avoid, that the human will adapt to the robot. So in some sense, what will be growing will be the interaction per se will be a novel thing. The dyad will be a new entity in some sense. And understanding this, it's a bit different from what, for instance, I showed you so far, in which you study, you fix the robot and you study what impact has this robot on the human, versus, I don't know, you fix the human, as imagine a training scenario in which the human should teach something to the robot, then you fix the human and you see whether the robot learns. As soon as both can adapt and should adapt to each other, then there is this cross-contamination. And this also brings another kind of issue, which we are exploring now, but a colleague of mine is reasoning about that. It is that of the self. So, or better, of the identity of the robot. So how much actually we should allow the robot, or should the robot be able to adapt, to change as a function of the human? Because if we have a chameleon robot that is only adaptive, then the interaction could really, in long term especially, could really become problematic, because the human loses the possibility to predict this entity. It's always changing. So I think it opens so the co-adaptation is crucial. I think this is the way to go. On the other hand, it paves up a new set of problems that I don't think have been already solved in the HRI domain. Coming to the second question, it's a combination indeed. So we have, talking about which models the robot use. In some cases, it's deep learning. In some cases, it's a different type of machine learning. It's sometimes is model based. So we are not always the deep learning solutions. So the AI off-the-shelf solution are okay for robotics for a lot of different reasons. One of which is the fact that they usually need a great amount of data, really great, and they work well if the data in the test set, so in the real world, are really similar to the one they have been trained with. But with a robot, usually there is an inherent uncertainty, variability, noise, And usually either you don't have that amount of data, or you don't want to have people manually annotate them, and you don't want, and the reality in which the robot lives changes a lot, so it's not stable. So you can, so there are colleagues of mine that are really working on making the robot leverage on its embodiment and on the fact that it can act on the world to really learn autonomously. So collect the right amount of data in the right way to leverage on or improve existing deep learning mechanism. The code, the ICAB in particular, in terms instead of language, the ICAB uses YARP, which is a sort of middleware, so an interface, if you want, between the low-level code, which is and the low-level hardware systems, if you want, so the motors, the sensor, etc., and the code, so that you don't have to know when you program exactly the details of each motor. This is handled upon, and it's written in C, C++, and it can interface also with Python recently, so it's improving.
Okay, we have now time for another question, I would say. Massimo, you had one?
Yeah,
yes, please.
But by the way, nice to see you again. I don't know if you remember, we met in Brussels for a meeting organized for ERC grantees. It was about research communication. And so like, I guess that the framework of your research is more in neurosciences, which is fascinating. But I wonder whether there is any room for considering also, let's say, cultural variability in the meaning of motion, you know, of the face, for instance. And second, if you see whether stillness is a particular case. So the stillness of robots is something that somehow represents a problem, because it's associated with somehow non-functioning, whereas the stillness of human beings can be associated with so many things. You know, Slavic taught us, you know, that it's impossible not to communicate, you know, through silence, etc. So just two questions, you know, that are probably out of the scope of your research, but just from a curious mind.
No, heavily connected actually. So what we strive, so we are very aware actually of the fact that a lot of signals have started from a cultural meaning. This is true for facial expression. This is true for gesture. So if I'm doing signaling with my gestures, they depend on culture. So what we do is two things. On one hand, we look at those mechanisms that are so rooted in our sensory motor functioning that are common to all the world, to all human beings. So if you direct your eyes to fetch an object, you will direct your eyes to collect information. It doesn't depend on your culture. It's something that you do even when you're alone. So this is something that remains true in any case. And for this, then we are confident that they are so basic that they are not heavily manipulated, let's say, by culture. Different story is for a gesture, facial expression, also some aspects of gaze, like mutual gaze. If I look at you in your eyes, it's something that is okay maybe in Italy, but maybe elsewhere it's not as appreciated. So in this case, what we can do and what we try to do often is to do cross-cultural studies. So we have a luckily nice collaboration with Japan, for instance, or with Canada. And this helps us maybe to try and tackle this separately. For the stillness, if I understand correctly, we actually noticed that it might be a problem in robots, in particular, if you consider basic movements, like, you know, I'm never perfectly still, as you said, I always blink my eyes. I rarely stare at you for a long time without blinking. What we notice is that if we turn this off on the robot, this is perceived as less pleasant, less likable when we're studying the very same interaction. So same dialogue, same everything, with the robot still, or with the robot with tiny movements that we call breathing and blinking, it really changed the thing. So yes, stillness is a factor. Without noticing, we notice it a lot.
Thank you very much, Grazie.
Okay, any other questions? So you have more advertisement in the chat now. And Lola, please, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, thank you for inviting me to the workshop as well.
Thank you for accepting.
Yeah, sure. And I think my talk is going to resonate quite a bit with Alessandra's diagnosis. So I'm going to address things that she actually mentioned quite a bit. So let me try and share the screen and share sound, optimize for the clip, and I think it is this one. Okay, can you
yes.
Can you see the slide?
Yes.
Yes. Yep. Okay. Okay. So yeah, Alfonsina asked me to. I gave a talk for CY Advanced last month as well, and she asked me to this time focus on one aspect and to try to talk a little bit about methods as well. And so I chose development and a developmental perspective on embodied emotion, cognition, and interaction in interactions between robots and humans, and focusing on the case of attachment, which is something that I have been working on for many years. Okay, so yeah, so within this talk, this talk is going to, within this workshop, sorry, this talk is going to bring this aspect of how these bonds, how affective bonds are built in interaction, but also how lifelong adaptation and learning, in the words, development are really essential and a very good methodology for social robotics, for robots to kind of learn new concept, new situation, develop new skills, and adapt to humans as they, they interact with us. So without having to kind of program anything, and then attachment and affective bonds provide the affective grounding and bootstrap these elements. So I'm going to talk a little bit of how some aspects of this adaptive behavior develop in the social context. That was one of the things mentioned, and what we can learn from interdisciplinary collaboration, so from the social sciences, but also from studies in more traditional machine learning, and which issues we should address when adopting developmental methods for human-robot interaction and social robotics. Okay, so very briefly, I'm going to kind of give my statement about my research, my position. So I model embodied affect, and by embodied I mean not just the fact that I'm using robots, humanoid or other robots, but really because I model how affect happens in the body and through the body. It cannot be, it's my take that it cannot be disembodied, and it can be, it is a kind of two-side coin. This embodiment happens externally. That's what we can observe in interactions, but also internally. There's a lot of internal processes going on, and that help to regulate homeostasis in in biological systems and in robots, if you take that approach like I do. And so I follow an embodied approach to artificial intelligence, which means that I am more interested in modeling dynamics of interactions between agents and their environment, social or physical, and the agents are really situated in environments and have limited knowledge and perception of the world. So they had to take that into account. So basically, and we're not trying to optimize. Our first speaker talked about the fact that we're kind of a generalistic species, that we're not very good at anything, but very good at just adapting. And so that's another aspect. Okay, so what do I mean by affect? So I mean different types of phenomena, not just emotion, and in particular motivation. I've been working on motivation for a very long time. So intuitively the wanting and the liking as a motivation for action or for cognition, like curiosity, for interaction. So that's motivation, the wanting. And the liking, emotion, one of the aspects of emotion is liking or disliking what we do or what we perceive or we know, etc. And the interaction between both is really important because they make things matter to us, and the same for robots. Everyone, robots to be able to care about things. We need to model these elements. They're the driving force for cognition as well. Okay, so yeah, these two elements, affect and cognition and motivation are very, really closely related. And I talked broadly about affective cognition. Okay, so in terms of methods, the way this is a very, very simplistic way of putting it, but you know, the wanting can be modeled in terms of drives, the simplest form that are based on the regulation of you know, homeostasis, the internal environment. And this can be modeled in robots, taking a bit of a cybernetics approach and that kind of algorithm. So we can give motivations to robots based on this kind of approach. We can, you know, model this mathematically with a very simple formula that will combine an internal deficit and the perception of you know, the external world to give urges for action. And we have a number of them and have to choose or make compromises. Okay, and the liking can also be modeled in terms of you know, an internal environment consistent of different you know, internal variables that need to be regulated, need to be kept within within good values, within permissible values. Otherwise, you know, your agent, biological or artificial, will die, will stop functioning. And so the simplest form of liking, pleasure, very simple sensory pleasure maybe, would be related to whatever makes you know, those internal variables go towards their ideal values, and this pleasure, things that would you know, make the variables in the internal environment go away. And so a way that in my team we model this is you simulating hormones related to how this you know, these variables change, basically. And those hormones will affect other elements of the control architecture, the software control architecture of the robot, or their perceptual capabilities, or the memory, etc. So different aspects of the cognitive architecture. So that's kind of the basis. Okay, and they can interact in very simple and at the same time very complex ways, because this creates very complex you know, dynamics. But anyway, so a way could be, you know, you have your simulated hormone affect the way an external stimulus is perceived, so more salient or less salient under different you know, emotional states, different circumstances that trigger different emotional states, or the perception of an internal you know, an internal parameter as well. So just to give you an idea of simple ways of putting it. Okay, so yeah, modulation of, you know, this kind of hormones could change the way we perceive the external stimulus, or the way our body, our actuators, our senses work. Okay, a word about you know, the importance of affect for development and lifelong learning. So, you know, affect is on the one hand gives us the wanting, a motivation to learn, to continue to learn and interact. So, you know, makes it wanting to learn and to interact and enjoying it. Another element, which you know, is what I'm going to focus more, is affective bonds and attachment. So they're kind of a method to guide attention towards what's important towards interactions that are safe, that are going to be, you know, guiding other things. So learning in infants, for example. And this carries over in adult life. And development is, you know, the sensory motor development and cognitive development and emotional development are all closely related. And so affect and affective interactions guide how we grow and change through life in all these aspects. Learning, we can also learn from affective interactions, taking into account affective feedback as signals to, you know, for some sort of unsupervised learning. And well, learning to regulate our emotions and emotional intelligence is also a very important aspect in development. So, and that, you know, takes, it has kind of different phases through development. Okay, so quickly, you know, learning, we could take those, you know, affective internal signals. For unsupervised learning, things are going well, things are going not well, and not going well. So this action led to, you know, an improvement in internal management of internal variables. So that's a good signal, etc., etc. So could be coupled with, for example, reinforcement learning or the types of learning. They can also be used to learn about the external environment. So, you know, arousal kind of sort of simulated stress or overactivity, well, simulated actually, the activity in the neural network of the role, for example, can be taken as a way of modeling arousal. So that can be, you know, excessive novelty or a surprise or something that changes too suddenly, could be produce too much arousal, and that can be taken as a negative signal, you know, to avoid that place. So be careful there, you know, for a robot to learn that. Whereas location with low arousal could be too boring, it's not worth exploring. Medium arousal, okay, a good place to explore, etc. So I said one of the functions that I said, but I would like to talk more about the this development and attachment, development of social bonds. So we share with you know, with other mammals, the fact that we're social mammals, and we are an affiliative species, and we group in, you know, crowding groups and tribes, and share forms of child rearing with other, you know, other mammals. And we can, you know, define attachment. Attachment is something that we find in mammals and other related phenomena in other species like birds, like imprinting. So we can define it as a drive somehow to maintain proximity to a caregiver. And so I mentioned the word drive, which means that in terms of, you know, how we model this, we can use a very similar model to what I, you know, showed at the beginning, in terms of controlling, you know, a homeostatic model, so controlling something to keep it in the range of, you know, permissible values, etc. So we can apply very similar ways of modeling to this element. Okay, so let us move on. And as I said, there's another related phenomenon, imprinting in birds. Conrad Lorenz, one of the fathers of ethology, studied quite a lot. So he well, observed and experimented that birds follow the first thing they saw, and that first thing tends to move, and that first thing tends to be their mother, their parent. So one of my then PhD students, quite a while ago, Lola Cañamero, work on modeling this phenomenon of imprinting, and so taking modeling in a robot that would like to, you know, keep the first perception that it had when it hatched, when it was turned on. And the first, using, for example, a very simple sensors, infrared sensors, it will detect a distance to something. Okay, so it would like to, it will want to keep that distance as constant as possible. And as a result, you know, it would, if the thing ahead moved, the robot will move back that way. So that's kind of the really basis of the model, very basic. Okay, model. So something like, probably is there. Okay, so we follow someone. That's someone. It can be a human caregiver. That for the robot is just a distance and not much more. But it already gives rise to, you know, those behaviors or approach and follow. And these behaviors in newborns of different species provide advantages in terms of, you know, security and social facilitation and learning and many other things. So we thought of using the same kind of element to try and get those advantages in for robots as well. So of course that is just the beginning, but then there's this affective element that, you know, comes from comfort, not necessarily other things. I had not actually, maybe I go back a couple of slides. Yeah, so these are, you know, experiments that Harlow did in the 50s with, I think, rhesus monkeys, I think they were, raised in a nursery. So they were orphans, and they put two surrogate mothers. So one that would provide food, but you can see it's iron and very uncomfortable to touch. And the other one had nothing. But it was very comfy to touch, very pleasant. So what happened when, you know, when the monkey was hungry, it would go to this iron mother. But when the monkey was stressed or was afraid, would not go to this one. It would go to the one that provided nothing but comfort. Okay, so that is a very important role of the caregiver. So we use this discomfort, you know, as a signal to help the robot learn about things. For example, do I have a video here? To learn to accept new stimuli. So, you know, the caregiver just gives some tactile comfort. That's okay. So that's, you know, the robot avoiding something that is new. But then the caregiver can provide some comfort by touching the robot on the side. And that, I think it is this one. You know, and that will have an effect on the neural network of the robot. Okay. You help it learn, accept other things, learn other things. It's okay because my caregiver is giving me this signal that is comfort. Okay, so those are very simple mechanisms. It gets much more complex, obviously. Then you can take, you know, the change the way the robot behaves by itself as a function of the internal well-being. If, you know, if the internal variables are well managed, it will maybe, you know, start imitating, change the way it behaves, and start just mirroring what is happening. And so there's this little imitation kind of game that that just emerges. So in terms of what's behind, what's you know, mechanisms that are behind this kind of work, well, it's kind of very simple, actually learning by association. So what the robot is trying to do is to control a perceptual error, we could say. So I spoke, you know, I talk about this, the first perception that the robot has, is a distance, and tries to keep that. If the whatever is in front, so the caregiver moves, there is an error because the distance changes. So the robot will want to correct that error. So that's kind of the initial, the initial you know, state. And so, you know, there will be this perceptual goal to correct this, some learning of different kinds, you know, and adding comfort, et cetera, et cetera. But It is learning by association mostly. Okay, so something that is important is at which rate this learning takes place, because we don't want, I think, Alessandra mentioned something related. We don't want, the robot to learn everything, to forget everything. If the robot is constantly learning, then things do not consolidate. So something that is important is to change their learning rate so that the robot will learn more slowly with time, so that things can consolidate. But we want to, to be able to reverse that as well. So these are things that we had to, take into account, and feedback from the caregiver can help to regulate, for example, that learning rate. So it has to decrease with time to consolidate learning, but also permit new learning, and interaction with a human caregiver could, can help regulate that. And learning should also change as a function of the relevance of the stimulus, not only the time. So how does the robot, assess what is relevant or what is not relevant? So again, the role of the caregiver, the kind of effective input from the caregiver. Okay, so I'm not going. I just wanted to show, because Alfonsina asked me to just show some methods and some equations and stuff. So you can also have something like some sort of affective stamps on the memory, and learn things at different time scales. As a function of a perception, a sensation is associated with a state of well-being or with the external comfort of the caregiver, etc. And that can be used also to retrieve memories. So maybe in a more, happier state, more pleasant, better well-being, we remember things that are closer to us in memory. So this, affective stamp will help us retrieve those, closer memories, whereas in a, fearful state or in a more negative state, we might want to go, back in the past and retrieve memories that might be relevant or make us more cautious. Okay, so discomfort and how the well-being is managed help also to manage memory in the robot, for the robot to learn. Okay, so so the architecture grows a little bit with new modules, but anyway, let's skip this and move on to some other things. Okay, there you go. So other features of attachment, besides it providing this way of learning, it's a secure base to explore the world and safely return to when we have needs or we're stressed, distressed. And so this bond has a calming influence on the infant, in this case, a robot. And this influence is of course mediated through social interactions between, the diet that can be distal or can be proximal, can take many different forms, and there are different caregiving profiles. There's no one, no universal gold standard, and it's very actually influenced by society and by the culture. So one of the things that we did as part of a EU project quite a while ago already, but working with developmental psychologists and comparative psychologists, was to work on a model of attachment that was slightly a little bit different to what is like the classical attachment theory that is is concerned with classifying what is a good attachment. If a baby is properly attached, the attachment relation is good, is safe, it's as it should be, or is insecure, etc. So they're mostly concerned with classifying forms of attachment as a function of how the children respond to situations when they're distressed, how they relate to their caregivers. But here we wanted to do something a little bit different, and so focus on the role of positive affect in the development of attachment bonds. And I mentioned, so these videos are from Kim Barr in Portsmouth. You know, attachment can, these social bonds and these relations can have many different forms. So in a Western culture, in the UK, for example, it has it's very distant, and it usually involves objects, direct interactions through objects. In other cultures, it's much closer and involves moving and dancing. So it's very, very different. In our relatives, human primates like chimpanzees, it's also different, but very similar. So here it looks like the mother is not paying attention to what the baby is. The baby is hanging from very, very high in the enclosure. Just because the morphology is completely different, so their peripheral vision is really, really good. So the mother doesn't need to look at the baby to see the baby. So that social signal is very different. They have very long arms and they're very strong. So if anything happens at that distance, the mother will just grab the baby, no problem. So it's not that she's disregarding, the baby. Okay, so I mentioned, I think by my watch, I have 5 more minutes. Is that correct? Or Alfonsina?
So we have 2 minutes time, Francesca.
Okay, I've been speaking for 25 minutes.
Yeah, because this was my question to Francesca. We have actually a slot till 4 o'clock, so we are running out of time.
Okay.
I don't know if we should probably consider that our slot is till 4 o'clock.
Okay.
So just the time for one question, and then I think we should say bye to Francesca, or yeah.
Okay.
I'm checking.
Okay, she's checking.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. Well, while she's checking, maybe. Okay, so let's. Yeah. So here's an example. I'm not going to play the video, but Francesca checks. I'll keep talking. Where so, a human was trying to teach a robot a task, to coordinate, to learn the movements of an arm using this ball. And what the robot is using is the prediction of the movements. So how the human actually shows the ball. So when we talked to participants that they had to be careful because the robot had to pick up that signal, they could not really coordinate. They were really uncomfortable, and so the robot could not learn the task well. But then we decided to add some affective signals and very simple signals, that sensations, and we told people that they could talk to the robot. It's not going to understand you, but might pick up some aspects of your tone of voice. But just talk, do the normal things. So people started to behave much more naturally, talking to the robot, moving, and they all of a sudden felt comfortable and started coordinating. They didn't know that the robot was using actually this prediction, and that they had to coordinate. We didn't tell them that, and so they started coordinating spontaneously. And so there was this interaction, reading these affective signals instead of other things, and then started using it. Francesca, how am I doing? Do I have to stop, or?
She wrote in the chat that we have time till 16:30, so you can go on for.
Oh, okay.
I don't know. Yeah. Okay.
Okay, brilliant. Okay. So here's is another, another topic that has been mentioned by Alessandra. So affective adaptation. We want the robot to adapt to the human. The human seems to naturally adapt to the robot, but what we don't want is to have to kind of train the robot. So we want the robot to be able to adapt in a natural way and to, adapt to someone. And if it interacts with someone else who is very different, be able to change that on its own. So, well, in this case, we have, a robot that is learning about the objects in a new environment, and novelty produces hyperactivity in the, let's say, in the neural network that is controlling, that is doing the learning. And so we can take that hyperactivity as like a measure of the arousal of the robot. Okay, so that's part of the model. And so in this case, what we added was trying to put the human in the loop for the robot to actually ask for help when that stress is too much and is blocking the learning. So just asking for help with very simple signals like looking around, not necessarily saying anything, but just looking around her face or showing some impatience or things like that. Okay, so what we then took into account is how the human responds. So how responsive they are in terms of frequency, but also how they respond, using which sensory modalities, for example. And that is going to have an impact, modulate the way the social motivation of the robot works, so social motivation to interact, but also to express needs and to express things. Okay, so I'm gonna show a video here. Okay, so this is a robot that has been interacting with a caregiver that satisfies all the needs of the robot constantly. So the robot is very expressive, very like, a spoiled child, really, expressing all the needs. Okay, constantly. And the caregiver is satisfying the needs constantly, and it's touching the robot, showing the face. Okay, so now we see a robot that has been, same robot, but has been for a while, for some period, interacting with a person with a very different interaction profile. It's expressing the same needs, but it's due to the way or the lack of feedback from this person, is much more subtle expressing them, so maybe nonverbal, not talking too much. Still, the caregiver cares, but it has a very different style. And what happens here is that actually that sign of a nice patting the robot has a much bigger impact on the robot, because it's so rare that gives rise to like joy, whereas in the other one it won't, because it's something so normal that the change is not relevant. Okay, so we add in more layers here. We develop also an epigenetic kind of model, epigenetic adaptation, based on, let's say, synthetic hormones that regulate all the synthetic hormones that act on different parts of the architecture of the robot. So taking inspiration from, from effects of cortisol and testosterone, and in regulating the internal environment and the effects of those hormones and how things are regulated internally. So in this case, we use different types of robots, but let's say same model as before, you know, a robot that will have internal variables like energy, health, temperature, and some hormones that signal for how those internal parameters are kept, so well kept or less well. And then other, my student called neurohormones, John knows, you know, curiosity, stress that get secreted when the homeostatic variables, curiosity, are you know, at good levels, or stress when they're at low levels, or the robot is overstimulated, for example. Okay, so this, I'm going to show like the kind of underlying neural network later, but I'm going to show this video that I like a lot. So robot developing without hostile caregiver. The caregiver is a pattern of movement for this robot, okay? And what happens here is that the caregiver is not letting the robot explore. So is interrupting, is handling the robot very roughly. And so basically the kind of neural network that is controlling the robot doesn't have enough time to converge. So very few things are learned, doesn't stabilize and anything. Okay. So, you know, and so this is kind of the phenotype, behavioral phenotype that develops, which is, you know, a robot that is going to basically avoid that pattern and that pattern of movement, and try to go to areas that are safe, where movement is, you know, is not present, like the walls. Okay. And, you know, same architecture, same robot, but developing with an attentive caregiver that is going to stimulate the all the sensors of the robot properly, so that the robot has time to, you know, smoothly. So the robot has time to learn the new perception. It's going to also expose the robot to different textures in the environment, so richer sensory experience. We can talk about experience for the robot. Okay, I think so exposing the robot to different all sort of stimuli. And so, you know, what develops here is a very different phenotype. It's a phenotype that is going to try and get more of those, you know, that nice stimulation, and is going to be open to exploration and try to, you know, once novel stimulation of all experiences. So you can see, looks very playful to an external observer, but it's yeah, curious. Okay, so what's underlying this kind of you know, epigenetic mechanisms can be different things. The main thing is this dynamic between you know, hormones that affect the kind of the release of other hormones, and those other hormones are going to affect the growth or the behavior of the underlying architecture. The underlying architecture can be a neural network or can be other things. So in this case, for example, a neural network, those hormones will affect the creation of new nodes as the robot learns new things, new nodes associating different you know, sensory modalities, different yeah, perceptions are going to be created. Okay, and so the hormones are going to control the strength of the links and the formation of those links, for example. And so we start with some input nodes, and this hidden layer is going to grow. It's going to be developed as the robot interacts. So, and as a function of those interactions that are going to produce, you know, the release of these hormones that interact with yeah, with these elements of the architecture. So it can be, in this case, is one. So here you have another, so an example of nodes that form, you know, linking visual stimulus 1 with infrared 2, and to create V1 IR2, etc. So the output layer kind of is the signal is going to be, well, how those hormones are going to, the release of those hormones. Okay, so we can inspect how the this neural network develops. And for example, if we have a look at robots developed in different environments with different, sensory experience, so we can see, for example, a robot that was raised in a box where, inside a box, put inside a box where it could barely move, just a little bit forward and back. And that was it. That was all the simulation it had. Developed a really very poor network. A robot in an environment a bit more, more standard, where with more novel objects and more interactions with physical, other physical objects, and could also be a person, a caregiver. Develops a richer neural network that and the associated behavioral functionality and kind of cognitive. Robot in a very novel environment, much richer environment, then develops a richer network, and after repeated exposure, you can see kind of areas of the network specializing in, maybe object recognition of different types of objects or different behaviors, etc. So you can actually inspect inside the robot. Okay, so I am going to just stop here, saying that these affective bonds are really, developing these affective bonds can ground a lot of things in the robots that we build, so that they, they adapt to us better. But not just temporarily, but hopefully over a long period, in terms of lifelong, we could call it, development and learning. And my message is always that affect is really this core, very simple core affect is, it's very important because makes things matter to us, but also, to robots. Thank you very much. And I'm not going to raise the issues at the end, because maybe someone will raise. Okay, thanks.
Okay. I thank you very much. And we have time for questions. Any questions? Yes.
So I have a question, if there's no one else. Mine is less of a technical, since I'm very familiar with Lola's work, and we've done collaborations in the past with Alessandra and Lola. Mine will be more of a curiosity for the imprinting, because you covered very well in modeling the process, the phenomenon of imprinting in HRI. So how it would be governed by the affective interaction between the caregiver and the robot, and how quickly it can learn something, also depending on the learning rate, which at the beginning needs to be higher. I had more of a curiosity of what would happen if we try to model the inverse of the baby duck syndrome, which is seen by people when we use a piece of software or technology and we imprint on the first thing we use, and then everything else gets judged by it, by comparing it with it. Can you see the case for having the same thing with a robot, where if the imprint is done with the first caregiver, then every subsequent person that the robot interacts with, that tries maybe to teach the robot something, is kind of compared with this first caregiver that was imprinted on? How would you?
Very interesting question, actually. The first imprinting is going to always have some sort of impact, but it has in us as well. Okay, so I'm not sure it's a bad thing. Mm-hmm. If we think of robots as, being situated in an environment, so they grow in like kind of the family or a society or group where they're going to be working, they're going to be interacting with. But of course, they have to be flexible and adaptive and continue learning. And so there has to be an opportunity for this to happen. So this kind of learning, it's like when we go to another country and there are things that are very, very different. Some are too different and we never adapt to them, but some are, we adapt. Some people are more flexible and some people are less flexible. So I see, it's pretty similar to robots. We don't want the robot to completely change, maybe. We might want, we could decide, we as designers, we could decide to, build a robot where this could be reversed, like the example of the, the robot that we saw that was either very needy and very expressive or more subtle, depending on who had been interacting with. And that was, one after the other, not either or. So after interacting with one, then interacting with the other. So, I think there is a lot of, there has to be a trade-off, but I think this is a very good question for like an interdisciplinary study, with, sociologists and all sort of disciplines. What sort of robot, how much should the robot be conditioned by the initial, the initial experiences, how much it should adapt, how much. So, maybe it depends on the humans he's going to, and the purpose, because it could, we might want a robot that actually educates people to be more flexible with others and more open. So it's a very good question.
Also, which modalities it would impact? So maybe like interacting with new people that have not been your primary caregiver. Maybe you're more open to learn new things, but the long-term trust might be lower. I mean, it's a very there's a lot of room to to explore what might happen. But it's I actually, at the moment we're all wearing masks and kind of walking further away from people when we're not on internet. I actually noticed that dogs, when I walk, many dogs seem to avoid people. Like, walk further than they would normally. I don't know, maybe it's just because, maybe it's kind of an illusion, but it's something that with friends, we have commented on. So, they seem to have noticed that humans are avoiding each other or something, and they have adapted to that a little bit. I don't know. So it's something that actually as signals change, their interactions change. So maybe, robots could also adapt to pick up those signals and adapt to different circumstances, not just different people. Thanks.
Thank you.
Any other questions, Alessandra? No? No questions? I would say no more questions. I was very happy to have you here today. I thank you very much. And I would like to draw your attention, this is also a bit of advertisement, to our last call, Move Your Body. It was published yesterday on Frontiers in Psychology and in Education. And it is a call we published together with Jessica Lindblom. Alessandra knows her. She works with me. She worked with me on the first volume I published a long time ago, and with another fellow, Salvatore Monteleone. He was a fellow here and left the Institute at the end of October, and she's now in our group for this call. And also, we are going to work together, Lola and I, and I'm really, really very happy for this opportunity. So I thank you very much for being here, and I hope to meet you, not online, to meet you in a traditional meeting after this difficult time. Thank you very much. I think we can we can leave. Francesca, would you like to add something? I don't know.
Excellent.
Okay, I thank you very much for your kind help. You are always there for us. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, have a nice afternoon.
You
Have a
too.
nice
Thank you
afternoon.
very much. Thank you.
Bye.
all.
Thank you.
Thank you
Very much.
Messina. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Alfonsina. It was great. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Great. Thanks.
Ciao.